The Megalodon of the Pacific. WWII's encounter with a prehistoric beast. Have you ever heard about soldiers encountering creatures they couldn't explain during a war? Or perhaps something so monstrous that it changed everything they knew about reality? Imagine the chaos of a battlefield. Explosions echoing, smoke swirling, and the ground shaking beneath your feet. But among the gunfire and the madness, there's something else. Something lurking just beyond the chaos, waiting. It was during the most brutal days of World War II when something unexplainable happened. In the middle of a fierce battle in the Pacific, a group of soldiers reported seeing something that they couldn't explain, nor could anyone else. And no, it wasn't an enemy soldier or a terrifying weapon. It was something much, much worse. On the dark, moonless night of an ongoing battle, a squad of soldiers found themselves huddled together in an abandoned structure, hoping to survive the onslaught. They were exhausted, fearful, and aware that any moment could be their last. But what they saw that night, no amount of preparation could have prepared them for. Everything was still, too still, just the crackling of distant artillery and the occasional rustle of the wind through the trees. Then a noise, a ripple. It wasn't the sound of a bomb, nor was it the flutter of an animal in the brush. This sound, it was different. It was a deep, resonating hum, almost like a vibration felt in the bones. It echoed from the depths of the ocean itself. No one knew where it came from, and no one could explain it. Suddenly, something emerged from the shadows, and for the briefest moment, the soldiers thought they were seeing things. But what they saw was very real. In the dim light, a massive, shadowy figure moved across the water, its shape monstrous and terrifying. A huge fin, larger than anything they had ever imagined, cut through the water like a knife through butter. It wasn't a ship. It wasn't a plane. It wasn't even a large marine creature they had ever encountered before. This was something different. This was something ancient. And as they stared, paralyzed by fear, one of them, a seasoned lieutenant, whispered something that would haunt them forever. That's not just a shark. As the figure disappeared into the darkness of the night, the squad's fear was replaced by confusion. The lieutenant, however, was certain. He had seen it, and he knew what it was. Something prehistoric. Something huge. For years, they would tell their story. Some of them would even try to forget it. But the more they tried to bury it, the more the memory of that night gnawed at them. They couldn't explain what they had witnessed, and they certainly didn't want to. But there was one survivor, the one who could never forget what happened that night. And he would eventually tell the truth. But that's not where the story ends. Because that night, what they saw wasn't just a one-time encounter. It was the beginning of something much larger. A mystery that had been hidden beneath the surface for centuries. A mystery so ancient that even the greatest minds of the time couldn't explain it. The squad's encounter with this creature, the Megalodon of the Pacific, was only the start of something far bigger. And the strange thing is, the only survivor of that battle has kept silent about what really happened. Until now. But today, we'll uncover that. Keep watching, because the evidence, the chilling facts and details will unravel a mystery that not only questions the past but challenges everything we thought we knew about prehistoric creatures, war, and the unexplainable forces that still roam our world. So, do you think this could be real? Could there really be something as ancient and monstrous as the Megalodon lurking in the depths of the Pacific? Or is this just another story passed down to scare people? Let's find out together. But before we continue, remember, you don't want to miss a single moment of what comes next. Hit that like button if this story surprises you, and let us know your thoughts in the comments. You might just be one of the few who uncovers the truth. It wasn't long after the terrifying glimpse of the massive shadow in the water that strange signs began to surface. At first they were subtle, almost too small to notice amidst the chaos of the ongoing war. But slowly they began to add up, and what started as a mere sense of unease soon grew into something more profound, something unexplainable. The first strange event happened just days after the encounter by the shore. The soldiers, still haunted by what they'd seen, tried to shake it off, convincing themselves that the fatigue, the stress of battle, and the exhaustion from months of conflict had played tricks on their minds. But as the days passed, it became clear that something far more sinister was at work. Late one evening, while on patrol near the jungle, a piercing, high-pitched sound filled the air. It was unlike anything they had heard before. It wasn't the typical whistling of wind through the trees or the distant cry of an animal. It was something that resonated deep in their chests, making their hearts race as if they were being drawn into something larger, something they couldn't see. The men froze in their tracks, trying to pinpoint where it was coming from. But the sound was coming from everywhere, like it was all around them. And then, as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The eerie silence that followed was just as unsettling. The soldiers looked at each other, unsure of what to make of it. Their nerves were already on edge, but this wasn't normal. And then a figure, no, a shadow, moved at the edge of their vision. One of the soldiers pointed it out, but when the others turned to look, it vanished into the thick foliage. "Did you see that?" one of them asked, his voice trembling. "I saw it," another replied. "But what the hell was it?" They stood there for what felt like an eternity, waiting for something, anything, to break the tension. But there was nothing. Just the oppressive silence of the jungle, broken only by the occasional rustle of the wind. Over the next few days, these strange occurrences escalated. The soldiers began to notice odd markings on the ground, large, unnatural shapes that seemed to appear overnight. Strange lights flickered in the distance, and even the air itself felt heavy. It was as if they were being watched. But by who or what? One night, while standing guard near their encampment, a soldier swore he saw a figure standing at the edge of the tree line. The figure was large, but not quite human, and it seemed to have an almost ethereal quality to it. When the soldier tried to call out, the figure turned and disappeared into the shadows. When he went to investigate the area, there was no sign of anyone. Nothing but a faint, sickly smell of salt water and something else. Something metallic, like the scent of blood. "That wasn't a man," the soldier muttered to himself. "That wasn't human." The others didn't know what to make of his story, but the unease was spreading. The crew was starting to feel it. There was something unnatural in the air, something that made them question everything they knew. Was it just the war? Was it the constant barrage of stress and fear? Or was there something more ancient, lurking just beyond their understanding? Days turned into weeks, and the sightings continued. Some soldiers would report hearing footsteps behind them, only to turn and find no one there. Others felt an overwhelming sense of dread in the middle of the night, as if they were being drawn into something beyond their control. The sounds from the ocean, those deep, vibrating hums, grew louder and more frequent, until the men could no longer ignore them. It felt like the very waters were alive, like something deep beneath the surface was waking up. One night, while a small group was stationed near a cliff overlooking the sea, they saw something that made them freeze in fear. It wasn't a ship or a boat. It was a shadow, stretching across the surface of the water. Something so large that it made the sea itself tremble. The shape moved slowly, deliberately, as though it was testing the waters, feeling its way through the darkness. And then, just as quickly, it disappeared beneath the waves. The men stared at each other, disbelief painted across their faces. There was no explanation for what they had just witnessed. What was out there? Could it be real? Or was it all in their heads? Maybe we're just seeing things, one soldier suggested, weakly. But deep down, they all knew this wasn't just a hallucination. No, this was something far worse, something ancient, something that had been hidden from the world for eons, buried beneath the ocean's depths. Something that had come to life in the middle of a war, an unwelcome reminder of how little we truly know about the world we live in. And then, there was the sound, that same deep hum. But this time it was different. It felt like it was coming from inside their very minds, vibrating in their bones, as though it was calling to them. Something, or someone, was out there. Something that wasn't human. Could it be possible? Could this be the same creature, the Megalodon, that had once ruled the oceans millions of years ago, now awakened and lurking in the Pacific? Or was there something else entirely? Something that had never been seen before? The men were starting to realize they had no answers, and the more they tried to understand what was happening, the more they felt like they were descending into madness. And then, a voice broke through the chaos. One of the soldiers, the oldest and most experienced, looked at the others and whispered, "We need to find out what this is. We can't ignore it anymore." But how? How could they uncover the truth behind something so unfathomable? They would need more than just their weapons to survive this. They would need to understand what they were dealing with before it was too late. The mystery deepened. And as the days passed, the strange occurrences began to intensify until it became clear that the soldiers' nightmare was just beginning. What could be out there in the Pacific? What could have caused these terrifying signs? And what would happen next? Stay tuned, because the answers are out there. Somewhere. And if they don't find them soon, it might be too late. There's always that one person, the one who lives to tell the tale, the one who holds the key to understanding what really happened. But often the truth is harder to share than the silence of forgetting. For Lieutenant James Jimmy Callahan, that silence had haunted him for years. He had survived the battle, yes, but there were things he saw that night, things that nobody should have to see. And so, for decades, he kept the truth to himself. But now, in the quiet of his home, with nothing but the dim glow of a single lamp illuminating his face, he finally decided to tell the story. It wasn't for fame. It wasn't for attention. It was because, deep down, Jimmy knew that if he didn't share what happened, the darkness would swallow him whole. "I don't know where to begin," Jimmy said, his voice barely more than a whisper, as he leaned back in his chair. His hands, once firm and steady on the battlefield, now trembled as he gripped the edge of the table. The weight of what he was about to say pressed down on him. He had been avoiding this moment for so long. "I've thought about it every day since that night, but the more I try to explain it, the more impossible it seems. But I can't keep running from it. Not anymore." Jimmy looked up, his eyes clouded with memories that were still too vivid. He stared out the window, as if searching for the words in the distant stars. But all he could see was that night. The night everything changed. It was supposed to be like any other night during the Pacific campaign. Grueling, exhausting, and cold. They had set up camp by the edge of the jungle, just a few miles from the shore. There had been no sign of the enemy, just the ever-present hum of war in the distance. But something felt wrong. Something was off. At first, Jimmy chalked it up to the stress. He had seen too many horrors already, too many faces, too many battles, and the strain of war had begun to take its toll. But as the days went by, the sense of unease only grew stronger. It wasn't just the noises anymore. It wasn't just the shadows at the edges of his vision. It was the feeling that the world itself was somehow different, as if time itself had bent, just enough to make him question what was real. One night, he stood watch near the shoreline, staring out at the churning sea. The waves crashed violently against the rocks, but beneath that sound, something else, something deeper, vibrated through the air. It was like the ocean was alive, breathing, calling out to him. It shook him to his core. And then, that shadow. Jimmy closed his eyes, as though trying to block out the image. He could still see it in his mind's eye, the massive fin cutting through the water, sharp and unmistakable. Larger than anything he had ever seen in all his years in the Navy. But it wasn't just the size that was terrifying. It was the ancient power that radiated from it. It felt as though that shadow had been in the world long before man had even set foot on the planet. It had been watching, waiting. He had no idea what it was at first. He'd thought maybe it was a large whale or some kind of underwater creature. But it didn't move like anything he had ever seen before. It was too precise, too deliberate. It was as if the creature was stalking them, observing their every move. And in that moment, Jimmy knew it wasn't a coincidence. He had tried to tell the others. But how could he explain it? Who would believe him? Who would believe that they were being stalked by something prehistoric, something that shouldn't even exist in the world anymore? The first few hours after the sighting were a blur of panic and confusion. The men were on edge, eyes darting from side to side, scanning the horizon, waiting for something to happen. But as the night wore on, the silence returned. The ocean calmed. The vibrations ceased. For a moment, it was as though nothing had happened at all. But deep down, Jimmy knew it wasn't over. It wasn't even close. That creature was out there, somewhere, waiting. As days passed, the tension in the camp grew unbearable. Soldiers whispered to each other about what they had seen, half joking, half serious, as if by speaking the words aloud they could somehow make the nightmare disappear. But the truth was undeniable. They had seen something huge. Jimmy's story didn't end there. No, it was just the beginning of a long descent into terror. He knew somehow that the creature from the deep wasn't the only thing they had to fear. There was something else, something darker, more insidious, lurking beneath the surface of their understanding. I remember the way it felt when the ground started to shake, he continued, his voice dropping lower. Like the very earth was trembling with something that didn't belong here, something from a time we had no business disturbing. It wasn't just the Megalodon. It was like everything that followed, was connected to it, like it had a purpose. He paused, staring down at his hands. The shaking hadn't stopped since that night. Every time he closed his eyes, it came rushing back. Those unnatural shadows, the inexplicable sounds, the overwhelming feeling of being watched. Something was out there, something ancient, something beyond their understanding. But I never told anyone, Jimmy confessed. I couldn't. No one would believe me. They all thought it was just the war, just the stress. But when the others started disappearing, when the strange events kept happening, I knew I wasn't just imagining things. And I'm telling you now, what I saw wasn't normal. There was something down there in the Pacific waiting for us. Jimmy leaned forward, his eyes dark with the weight of the years he had spent holding this secret. He wanted to tell the whole story, wanted to explain the terrifying details, the moments that still haunted him. But part of him was scared. Scared of the truth. Scared of the thing he had seen. He looked directly at the camera, his voice barely a whisper. I've lived with this for too long. It's time the world knows what happened that night. And if they find out, if they come looking, there may be more to this than any of us are ready for. The room fell silent. Jimmy's words hung in the air like a thick fog. The mystery was unraveling, slowly, but it was clear that the truth was far stranger than anyone could have imagined. But what did it all mean? What was this creature, and why had it appeared during a war that had already cost so many lives? Was it some kind of omen? Or was it a force of nature that humanity had never understood? One thing was certain: Jimmy had survived. But at what cost? The events that unfolded in the days after Jimmy's revelation were nothing short of unnerving. Each day brought something new, something stranger than the last, until the soldiers couldn't trust their own senses. Every snap of a twig, every rustle in the leaves, felt like a harbinger of doom. The lines between what was real and what was imagined began to blur. And the worst part? They knew deep down that the creature from the depths wasn't the only thing they had to fear anymore. It was a late afternoon when things took a turn for the worse. The soldiers had spent the day on high alert, nervously watching the horizon. The sea, usually calm and predictable, had grown restless. The wind whipped across the water in unpredictable bursts, and the low, rhythmic hum that had once been faint had returned. It resonated deep within their bones. But no one dared speak about it anymore. Everyone had heard it. Everyone felt it. But it was easier to stay silent than to acknowledge the truth, that something was wrong. So they said nothing. They tried to pretend it was just the sound of the wind. But no one believed it. As night fell, the tension in the camp reached a breaking point. The soldiers had grown used to the isolation, to the endless vigilance, but the unnatural presence hanging in the air was like a weight on their shoulders, suffocating them with its darkness. Jimmy was sitting by the fire when the first sign of true terror came. It was a sharp, disorienting crack, like the sound of a branch breaking under an enormous weight. Everyone froze. The fire flickered, casting long shadows that danced like ghosts across the ground. "Did you hear that?" one of the soldiers whispered, barely above a breath. They all heard it. A second crack, this time closer. The sound wasn't right. It was too heavy, too deliberate. It was as if something huge was moving through the jungle, brushing aside trees like they were nothing more than twigs. Suddenly, the ground beneath them trembled. A low rumble, like distant thunder, sent vibrations through the earth. The soldiers exchanged uneasy glances, gripping their rifles, their fingers twitching on the triggers. The shaking intensified. The very ground beneath their feet seemed alive, pulsing in rhythm with the deep hum from the sea. "That's not an earthquake," Jimmy muttered, his heart racing in his chest. It's something else." The men didn't have to ask what he meant. They all felt it, the dread, the realization that they were no longer in control. But what could it be? Was the ocean itself somehow causing these disturbances? Or was there something more ancient, more monstrous, awakening beneath their feet? Then, without warning, the sky lit up. A strange, unnatural light bloomed on the horizon, a sickly greenish hue that bled into the clouds. The soldiers watched, spellbound, as the light flickered, moving erratically, almost as if it were alive. And then, in the midst of it, a shape appeared in the sky. A large, shadowy form, just for a split second. A giant fin, cutting through the clouds, so massive it seemed impossible. But before anyone could react, it was gone. "Did anyone else see that?" one soldier whispered, his voice barely audible, as if speaking louder would break the spell. They all had. And now, there was no turning back. The panic spread quickly. Some soldiers insisted it was a mirage, a trick of the mind. Others were more convinced. They had seen it. They had felt the shaking, heard the hum, and now this. the shape in the sky. Something was out there, something that no one had the answers to. But that wasn't all. Later that night, as they settled into their watch shifts, things started to happen. One by one, soldiers began to hear strange sounds, voices, whispers, as if the jungle itself was speaking to them. They couldn't make out the words, but the sound was unmistakable. Low, guttural, and rhythmic, like an ancient chant. Some of the men swore they saw flickers of movement in the trees, fleeting shadows darting between the thick trunks. But every time they looked, there was nothing there. The worst part? It wasn't just the men on watch who were affected. It was everyone. The soldiers who had been sleeping reported nightmares, terrifying visions of sinking into the ocean, dragged beneath the waves by an unseen force. Others dreamed of enormous jaws closing in around them, of a shadow so vast it blotted out the sun. One soldier, unable to take the pressure, snapped. He began shouting at his comrades, claiming that something was out there, something coming for them. His voice was ragged, filled with fear, and no one could calm him. He bolted from the camp in a panic, disappearing into the jungle. The next day, when the search party went to find him, they discovered nothing but a faint trail of footprints leading to the edge of the forest, where the sand met the sea. After that, the trail simply vanished. No body, no sign of struggle, just gone. The soldier's disappearance was the final straw. Fear now gripped the camp like a vice, its claws sinking deep into the hearts of the remaining men. They couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them, circling them, waiting for the right moment to strike. The laughter of the men had faded, replaced by hushed voices, darting eyes, and the sound of rifles being checked for the 100th time. That night, when the soldiers gathered around the campfire, Jimmy spoke up again, his voice steady, but filled with an underlying tension. "We're not just fighting a war anymore," he said, his gaze piercing the darkness. "We're facing something we don't understand. And I think it's been waiting for us." The others listened in silence, the weight of his words settling over them like a dark cloud. They had been soldiers, trained to fight enemies they could see, enemies they could confront. But this was something else, something far older, far more dangerous. The shaking, the shadows, the disappearances, the whispering voices in the wind. All of it pointed to one terrifying possibility. Whatever they were facing, it was not a part of their world. It was a relic from a time long past, buried in the depths of the Pacific. And now it had found them. But what was its purpose? Why had it come? And more importantly, how would they survive it? The answers were out there. But as each moment passed, it felt like time was running out. They were trapped between two worlds, one of war and one of nightmares. And no one knew which one would destroy them first. The soldiers were no longer just fighting a war. They were fighting something they could barely comprehend. The events of the past few days had shattered their understanding of what was real and what was merely a figment of their imagination. Yet, despite the growing unease, there was one question that lingered in the back of every mind. What was happening? Jimmy's eyes were clouded, haunted by the visions he couldn't escape. But as the days passed, something strange started to take shape. Memories, fragmented and blurry, began to resurface. Pieces of the puzzle he had buried for so long were slowly coming together, and they weren't at all what he had expected. One evening, while sitting alone at the edge of camp, Jimmy found himself staring out over the ocean once more, the restless waves crashing against the shore. His mind wandered back to that night, the night when everything had changed. He couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't just the presence of the Megalodon that had terrified him so. It was something deeper, something more ancient, and then Out of nowhere, a long-forgotten memory resurfaced. A conversation he'd had years ago, one that had seemed so insignificant at the time, suddenly took on a new, eerie meaning. It was an old man, a veteran of the First World War, someone Jimmy had met during his early years in the Navy. The old man had always been quiet, his eyes distant, as though he carried secrets that weighed him down. But one night, after a few drinks, he spoke of things that had sent a chill down Jimmy's spine. "You don't understand, boy," the old man had said, his voice thick with the weight of years. "There are things beneath the waves, things we've never seen, never understood. I've heard whispers, seen things in the water that no man should ever see. Those creatures, they're not just animals, they're the remnants of a time before us, a time when the oceans ruled the earth." Jimmy had laughed it off at the time. After all, he was young, full of bravado, and had no reason to believe in such fantastical tales. But now, as he sat there, staring at the dark expanse of the ocean, the pieces started to click together. It wasn't just a creature. It wasn't just a megalodon. It was a remnant, a leftover from an era long past, an era when the oceans were far more dangerous than anyone could have imagined. And whatever it was, it had been waiting for the right moment to return. Jimmy couldn't ignore it any longer. He had to find out more. He had to understand what was really happening. And so he decided to take a risk, something he hadn't dared to do before. He gathered a few of the soldiers, those he trusted most, and shared the story of the old man and the warnings he had given. At first they were skeptical. After all, they had seen enough horror on the battlefield to last a lifetime. But the events of the past few weeks, the unexplained tremors, the strange lights, the chilling whispers, had begun to change their minds. There was something out there, something ancient. And it wasn't just the war they had to worry about anymore. As they sat around the fire that night, Jimmy spoke again, his voice low and steady. "We're not just fighting for survival anymore. We're uncovering something that was never meant to be found. Whatever's out there, whatever's in the water, it's not just a creature. It's part of something bigger, something older." One of the soldiers, a man named Paul, leaned forward, his face tense with curiosity. "You're saying this is about more than just the Megalodon? That it's connected to something from the past?" Jimmy nodded slowly. "Yes, I think it's all connected. The creature, the strange signs, the disappearance of our men. It's all tied to something that goes back long before any of us were born. Something from the time of the dinosaurs." The others exchanged uncertain glances, but they could all feel it. This wasn't just another strange story. This was something they couldn't ignore, something that was already impacting their lives in ways they couldn't yet understand. Jimmy continued, his words heavier with each passing second. "There are rumors, old whispers, about a forgotten civilization that existed long before modern history. People who worshipped the ocean, who believed that the waters were home to gods and monsters. They say these creatures, these ancient beings, were not just animals. They were gods, forces of nature, with power that could control the very seas themselves." Paul frowned. "And you think that's what we're dealing with? Some kind of ancient god?" "I don't know what it is," Jimmy admitted. "But I do know one thing. What we're seeing isn't normal, and I think it's been waiting for us, for years. And now, with everything happening around the world, it's come back." The fire crackled, casting eerie shadows across their faces, as if echoing the growing unease that had begun to settle over the camp. What had started as whispers of strange occurrences now felt like a dark prophecy, unfolding right before their eyes. The ocean, which had once seemed like a vast, endless expanse of water, was now something far more sinister. It was a reminder of the ancient world, of the secrets buried beneath its surface, waiting to rise again. As the night deepened, the men sat in silence, their minds racing with the implications of what Jimmy had said. There was no turning back now. Whatever was happening, whatever they were dealing with, it was bigger than any of them could have imagined. The mystery was deepening with every passing hour. The past, long buried in the shadows of history, was now crashing to the surface, revealing a truth that no one had been ready for. And as the ocean waves crashed against the shore, the soldiers knew one thing for certain. They weren't just fighting for survival anymore. They were fighting to uncover a secret that had been hidden for centuries. But what would they find when they finally uncovered it? It was becoming impossible to deny it now. What had begun as strange occurrences, whispers in the wind, and odd shadows in the night had grown into something far more sinister. The soldiers were no longer just trying to survive, they were desperately trying to understand the madness that surrounded them. The unexplainable phenomena were multiplying by the day, and with every new event, the boundaries between reality and the supernatural seemed to fade. The air had grown thicker, the very atmosphere itself feeling like it was charged with an unseen energy. The ocean, once a simple, intimidating expanse, now felt like a living, breathing entity. Every ripple, every crashing wave felt as though it was calling to them, urging them to venture closer. And the closer they got, the more the darkness seemed to close in around them. One evening, during a routine patrol near the cliffs, something happened that made every soldier stop in their tracks. It wasn't the distant hum from the sea. By now they had grown accustomed to that unsettling vibration. But something far more alarming. A figure. It appeared not from the jungle, but from the very depths of the ocean itself. The soldiers had gathered at the edge of the cliffs, their eyes scanning the horizon, when a shadow moved across the water. At first, they thought it was a ship, but as it came closer, they realized it wasn't any vessel they had ever seen. The shape was enormous, so massive that it dwarfed the largest battleships. It was an indistinct silhouette, a hulking figure moving slowly beneath the waves, its massive form barely visible in the fading light. "Is that a submarine?" one soldier whispered, his voice shaking with uncertainty. "No," Jimmy replied, his voice cold, his face pale. "That's no submarine." The shape lingered on the water for what felt like an eternity before slowly disappearing into the depths. The soldiers stood motionless, their hearts racing, as if they were frozen in place by something far worse than fear. Something was watching them. And it wasn't just the Megalodon anymore. It was something far older, something even more terrifying. That wasn't the only strange occurrence. Over the following days, the soldiers reported seeing glimpses of a strange, ghostly figure in the distance, an enormous silhouette that seemed to rise out of the ocean during the twilight hours, disappearing as quickly as it appeared. Sometimes it appeared near the cliffs, other times near the shoreline, but each time it was accompanied by that familiar deep hum, an almost hypnotic sound that rattled their bones. One of the men, Paul, had seen it with his own eyes. He swore it was a ghost, a spirit of some kind, its figure massive and shadowy, just a blur against the backdrop of the ocean. When he tried to call out, the figure simply vanished. He hadn't slept since, his eyes wide with terror as he recounted what he had witnessed. It was huge," Paul said, his voice trembling. "It was like a warrior, tall, with a massive spear, or a weapon, I don't know. But the way it moved, it wasn't human. It was like it was from another time." But there were no answers. Only questions that seemed to grow more complicated with every passing hour. The soldiers began to question each other. Were they all seeing the same thing? Or was their collective fear conjuring these apparitions? They couldn't even trust their own eyes anymore. But the truth was clear. Whatever they were facing, it was beyond anything they could have prepared for. It wasn't just the appearances in the water, either. The land around them seemed to hold secrets, too, as though the very earth beneath their feet was hiding something ancient. Strange markings began to appear on the ground, symbols that didn't belong to any known language. One soldier, while digging a small trench, had uncovered an object buried beneath the dirt. An ancient stone tablet, worn with age, covered in intricate carvings. The moment he touched it, a shiver ran up his spine. The air around him seemed to freeze, as if time itself had paused. He quickly dropped the tablet, and for the rest of the day his hands shook uncontrollably. The discovery of the tablet was only the beginning. In the following days, more signs appeared. Small, almost imperceptible at first, like a thread connecting the strange occurrences. A faint outline of what seemed like a monstrous footprint was found near the edge of the camp, as though something impossibly large had been moving through the jungle at night. A strange, foul smell permeated the air, like decaying sea creatures mixed with the earthy scent of rotting wood. And one night, while on patrol, a soldier swore he saw glowing eyes watching him from the tree line before they vanished into the darkness. The atmosphere was thick with dread, and the men no longer felt like they were in control. The boundaries between the real world and the unknown were becoming impossible to ignore. They were being watched not just by enemy forces, but by something far older, far more dangerous. And it wasn't just a monster of flesh and bone. It was something beyond that, something supernatural, something ancient that had been awakened from the depths of time. In the midst of this madness, Jimmy found himself struggling to hold on to his sanity. He had always been a man of logic and reason, but the things he had witnessed, the things that were happening around him, were defying every rational explanation. He could feel the weight of the past pressing down on him, threatening to consume him. "We need to find answers," he said one night, his voice steady but filled with resolve. "Whatever's happening here, whatever we're facing, it's connected to something from the past. We need to uncover the truth before it's too late." The men nodded in silence, their faces grim, but there was no more room for doubt. They couldn't run from it anymore. The mysteries of the Pacific, the strange sightings, the unexplainable events, were not just stories. They were real, and the answers were buried somewhere, deep beneath the surface. The soldiers had no choice but to press on, to confront whatever was waiting for them. But every step they took brought them closer to the heart of the mystery, and further into the abyss. The night was thick with a sense of impending doom, the darkness pressing in from all sides, a weight that none of the soldiers could shake off. Despite their growing fear, they could no longer deny it. Something was happening here, something beyond their control. And the answers? They needed answers, desperately. But as they started looking for clues, the lines between what was real and what was imagined began to blur even further. Jimmy was determined to get to the bottom of it. He knew that they couldn't just sit idly by and wait for whatever haunted them to reveal itself. But where could they start? How could they even begin to make sense of the chaos around them? The more they investigated, the more it seemed like there were no answers, only endless questions. One morning, as the soldiers gathered to discuss the strange occurrences, a new idea surfaced. It was Paul who brought it up, his voice laced with doubt and fear. "Maybe it's not the war," Paul said, his eyes darting nervously to the others. Maybe Maybe this is something older, something that has nothing to do with us at all. What do you mean? Jimmy asked, frowning. I mean, look at what we're dealing with. Paul gestured to the camp around them. The disappearing men, the shadows, the whispers, the things we've seen in the water. None of this makes sense. It's like we've stumbled onto something that's been here long before any of us. Jimmy nodded slowly. It was a thought that had crossed his mind more than once. Whatever they were dealing with, it felt ancient. Something far older than any modern conflict, a force tied to the earth and the sea, something that had remained hidden for eons. But how could they explain it? Science couldn't. Logic failed them. So they were left with only one option: to dive deeper into the past, to unearth whatever had been buried beneath the waves for centuries. The search for answers began in earnest, with Jimmy leading the charge. They scoured the jungle, combed the coastline, and even started examining old records and maps in search of anything that could offer a clue. But what they found only added to the mystery. One of the soldiers, a young man named Turner, uncovered something that immediately sent a chill down his spine. While exploring a small cave near the beach, he found what seemed to be an old journal, its pages brittle and yellow with age. The journal's cover was worn, its leather bindings cracked, but the words written inside were still legible, though written in a language none of them recognized. Turner brought the journal to Jimmy, his hands trembling as he passed it over. It's something old, he said. I think it's from a shipwreck. But the language? I've never seen anything like it. Jimmy carefully flipped through the pages, his eyes scanning the strange symbols and diagrams. Some of the drawings were crude but detailed, illustrations of massive sea creatures, many of which didn't resemble anything they had ever encountered before. One drawing, in particular, caught his eye. A terrifying image of a great serpent-like creature with monstrous jaws and fins that seemed to ripple through the sea like the wings of a bird. Look at this, Jimmy muttered. It's describing a creature, but this isn't just a shark. This is something different. The journal spoke of something far beyond their comprehension. A creature, perhaps, but also a force, something tied to the earth and the sea in ways that modern science couldn't explain. It referred to ancient rituals, forgotten gods, and an unknown people who had lived and died along the Pacific coast centuries ago. They had believed in the power of the ocean, worshipped it, feared it, and revered the great beasts that lurked within its depths. The journal's final entry, written in jagged, hurried handwriting, gave Jimmy pause. The beast has awoken. The waves bring it back. It will come for us, and we will not survive. Jimmy's fingers froze on the page. His mind raced as the words seemed to settle deep in his bones. It will come for us. He closed the journal, his thoughts racing. What had this ancient civilization known? What had they seen beneath the waves that they had so desperately feared? The discovery of the journal raised even more questions than it answered. What had happened to the people who had written it? What had they encountered? And was this beast still out there, waiting? But that wasn't all they found. As they scoured the jungle, searching for any further clues, another strange artifact appeared. This time, it wasn't a piece of paper or a relic of an ancient civilization. It was something much more tangible. It was a large, rusted metal object, half buried in the sand. At first glance, it appeared to be some kind of wreckage from an old ship or aircraft. But the soldiers soon realized it wasn't anything they had ever seen before. It was shaped like a massive gear, several feet in diameter, with strange markings carved into its surface. The metal was covered in barnacles, like it had been submerged for decades, but there was no doubt that it didn't belong in the jungle. It didn't belong anywhere near a battlefield either. "Where did this come from?" Paul asked, his voice shaky as he examined the object. This isn't from any ship I've ever seen." Jimmy inspected it closely. The markings were similar to those in the journal, symbols like the ones carved on the ancient tablet. The markings seemed to pulse with a strange energy, almost as if they were alive, waiting for something. It was unsettling, but it was clear that this gear wasn't just an artifact. It was a clue, a piece of the puzzle. But what was it? And why was it here, hidden in the jungle, waiting to be found? Jimmy didn't know yet, but he was beginning to feel the weight of the truth closing in. Whatever this was, this creature, this force, it wasn't just tied to the ocean, it was connected to the land, to the earth itself. And whatever it was, it had been waiting for them to uncover its secrets. He turned to his men, his voice low but firm. "We're getting closer, but we need to be careful. Whatever we're dealing with, it's not just a creature, it's something older. And I think it knows we're coming for it." The soldiers stood in silence, the heavy weight of the unknown hanging over them. But they couldn't stop now. They had come too far. Whatever the truth was, they had to find it. But with every step forward, the terror only deepened. They were no longer in control. They were being drawn into something far darker than they had ever imagined. The atmosphere around the camp was suffocating, as though the very air had thickened with dread. The soldiers had long since stopped questioning whether the strange phenomena were just tricks of the mind. They had witnessed too much, felt too much, to continue denying the truth. The sea, the shadows, the whispers, it was all part of something much larger. But the question remained. What was it? Jimmy had made up his mind. They couldn't stay passive any longer. They had to dig deeper, uncover more, no matter the cost. The idea of facing the unknown, of confronting whatever ancient power lurked beneath the waves, terrified him. But the need for answers was overwhelming, and the soldiers had no choice but to follow him. They needed to know what they were dealing with before it was too late. Under the cover of darkness, the team set out on their first full investigation. Armed with only flashlights, their rifles, and the journal they had uncovered, they ventured into the dense jungle, closer to the cliffs, where the strange occurrences had first begun. The air was thick with humidity, the scent of salt water mingling with the damp earth. The jungle seemed alive, the trees whispering as the wind swirled through the underbrush. Every snap of a twig, every rustle in the leaves made their hearts race with anticipation, or perhaps with fear. "I don't like this," Paul muttered, his eyes darting nervously through the trees. "It's too quiet." "Stay alert," Jimmy said, his voice low but steady. "We're getting close." They reached the cliffs just as the moon rose high in the sky, casting long shadows across the rocky terrain. Jimmy led the group to a small outcrop of rocks overlooking the ocean, the same spot where they had seen the shadowy figure in the water just days before. It was eerily calm now, the waves gently lapping against the shore as though nothing had ever happened. But Jimmy knew better. Something had changed. Something was watching them. As they settled into their positions, they turned their attention to the ground, hoping to uncover more of the strange markings that had been appearing over the past few weeks. They had noticed a pattern in the shapes, the way they seemed to spiral, the way they resembled ancient symbols. But what did they mean? Turner, who had been walking a few feet ahead, suddenly stopped in his tracks. "Look at this," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The rest of the soldiers gathered around him, shining their flashlights on the ground. There, etched into the earth, was a massive circle over 10 feet in diameter. The edges were covered in strange symbols, just like the ones in the journal. But what was even more disturbing were the marks in the center. Long, claw-like scratches, as though something with immense strength had dragged itself across the ground. "What the hell could have made that?" Paul asked, his voice cracking with fear. "I don't know," Jimmy replied, his eyes scanning the circle. "But I think we're looking at a ritual. This isn't just random. Whatever left these marks, they were trying to summon something. And I think it's connected to whatever is out there in the sea." Turner squatted down, tracing the edge of the circle with his fingers. "Look at this," he said. "It's almost like a doorway, a portal." "A portal?" Paul repeated, disbelief in his voice. "What are you talking about? You can't seriously believe that." But Jimmy was silent, his eyes narrowing as he studied the marks. A portal to what? To the past? Or to something else? The question hung in the air, unanswered. But one thing was certain. The more they searched, the more they uncovered, the more they realized that this was no coincidence. This was something deliberate, something ancient and terrifying. As they continued to examine the circle, strange things began to happen. A cold wind began to blow, swirling around them, even though there had been no wind moments before. The faint hum from the ocean grew louder, vibrating through the ground, through the air, as if the sea itself was responding to their presence. Then, as if summoned by the very forces they had disturbed, something emerged from the darkness. At first it was just a shadow, something out of the corner of their eyes, moving along the water's edge. But as they turned to look, their flashlights revealed the unmistakable outline of a figure, a massive silhouette, towering and shapeless, moving slowly but deliberately toward them. The men froze. They knew what they were seeing. The creature. It was real. But this time it wasn't just a shadow. It was something more tangible, more present. The sound of its movement, deep, slow, heavy, rumbled through the air like the sound of the ocean itself turning in on itself. "Get back!" Jimmy shouted, grabbing Paul by the arm and pulling him toward the cliffs. "Now!" They scrambled up the rocks, their flashlights casting frantic beams of light as they desperately tried to get a better view of the creature. But the more they moved, the closer it seemed to get. It was as though the creature was closing in, responding to their every move. And then, with a deafening roar, it appeared. A massive shape, covered in shadows, its eyes glowing faintly with an unnatural light. The creature's massive form towered over them, its fins slicing through the air with terrifying precision. Its jagged teeth glistened in the dim light, and the low hum they had heard for so long reached a deafening crescendo. For a moment, everything went silent. Time itself seemed to freeze. The soldiers were paralyzed, unable to move, as they faced the unimaginable. But then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the creature vanished, slipping back into the sea, disappearing into the depths with a grace that defied its enormous size. They stood there, breathless, their hearts pounding in their chests. The reality of what they had just witnessed was beginning to sink in. The Megalodon was real. And it was not just a creature from the past. It was part of something far darker, something tied to the very fabric of the earth itself. Jimmy's mind raced. There was no more doubt. The creature wasn't just a force of nature. It was connected to something far more ancient. And whatever it was not going to stop. They had uncovered a terrible secret, and now there was no going back. "We need to find out what it wants," Jimmy said, his voice heavy with determination. "And we need to stop it before it's too late." But the more they investigated, the more they realized this was no ordinary enemy. This was something from the depths of time, something that had been lying dormant for centuries, waiting for the right moment to awaken. And now, that moment had come. The soldiers could barely breathe, let alone speak. The creature they had seen just moments before had vanished into the sea, but its presence still lingered, heavy and suffocating. The air around them felt charged, like a storm was about to break. They were no longer alone. Something ancient, something primal, was watching them, and they couldn't outrun it. Jimmy's hands trembled as he gripped his rifle, his knuckles white. His mind raced, trying to make sense of what they had just witnessed. It was impossible. A megalodon, a prehistoric shark that had been thought extinct for millions of years. Yet, here it was, moving with terrifying ease through the waters of the Pacific, as if time had no hold over it. "It's real," Paul whispered, his voice hollow. "We saw it. We saw it with our own eyes." "I know," Jimmy muttered, his eyes scanning the water nervously. He wasn't sure if he was hoping the creature would emerge again, or if he feared it would. "But what does it want? Why now? Why us?" The answer was just out of reach, like a door they couldn't open, a riddle they couldn't solve, but they had no choice but to press on. If the megalodon was just a part of this, then what was the true nature of the forces they were up against? They couldn't ignore the evidence any longer. The strange occurrences were no coincidence. The markings, the symbols, the ancient journal, they were all connected. But to what end? What had awakened this creature? And what other horrors had they unknowingly disturbed? As the soldiers gathered near the cliffs, still shaken by what they had just witnessed, a new sound echoed across the water. Something far too subtle to be an animal, but far too real to be dismissed. It was a hum, low and vibrating, like the resonance of the ocean itself. At first they thought it was the usual tremor from the deep, but as the sound grew louder, it became clear. It wasn't the water making that noise. It was something else. The ground beneath them began to tremble, as if in response to the hum. It was like the earth was shifting, and the soldiers, frozen in place, could feel it in their bones. The sound became rhythmic, almost like a heartbeat, deep, powerful, and relentless. "Do you feel that?" Turner asked, his voice shaky. "What the hell is that?" Before anyone could respond, the ground beneath their feet shifted violently, sending them sprawling onto the rocks. The tremors were unlike anything they had ever experienced before. It was as though the very earth was coming alive, as if some massive force was stirring beneath them. Jimmy pulled himself to his feet, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "We need to get back to camp now." They scrambled to their feet, hearts pounding as the tremors grew stronger. The hum was no longer just a sound. It was a presence, vibrating through the air, through the ground, through their very souls. The soldiers had faced countless battles, but this was something far more terrifying than any enemy they had ever fought. Just as they turned to leave, something appeared at the edge of the water. A massive shape rising from the depths. At first they thought it was the megalodon again, but this time it was different. This time, it wasn't alone. There were more. Dozens, if not hundreds, of massive shapes, rising from the water like a nightmare made real. Gigantic fins sliced through the waves, their shadows long and ominous against the moonlit water. The megalodon was not a solitary creature. It was part of something much larger, a forgotten army of monsters, stirred from their ancient slumber by forces they didn't yet understand. The soldiers stood, paralyzed, as the creatures emerged from the water. Their massive bodies glided silently through the ocean, their eyes glowing with an unnatural light. They moved in unison, as if they were being controlled by something greater than any one of them could comprehend. Jimmy's heart was in his throat as he tried to make sense of what he was seeing. These weren't just sharks. They weren't just animals. They were something else entirely. They were ancient, a forgotten race from the depths of the ocean, brought back to life by some unknown force. And now they were coming for them. "We need to get out of here," Jimmy said, his voice a low growl. "Now." But it was too late. The creatures moved closer, their movements synchronized, as though they were converging on a single point. The soldiers backed away slowly, their rifles raised, but they knew it wouldn't matter. They were outmatched. They were out of their depth, both literally and figuratively. A sudden crack of thunder echoed across the sky, and the creatures surged forward, their massive bodies moving through the water with terrifying speed. The first one broke through the surface, its enormous mouth opening wide to reveal rows of jagged teeth. It was no longer just a creature. They were beasts, ancient gods of the ocean, awakened to reclaim the world that had forgotten them. Jimmy turned to his men, his eyes wide with terror and determination. "Get to the jungle, now!" But they didn't get far. As they turned to flee, the ground beneath their feet trembled again, harder this time. The earth cracked open with a deafening sound, sending rocks tumbling down from the cliffs. And then, as if in answer to the chaos they had unleashed, the ground itself seemed to rise. A massive, skeletal form broke through the earth, its enormous bones glowing with an eerie light. It was like something out of a myth, an ancient titan, its body covered in barnacles and seaweed, its eyes hollow and empty. But the moment it appeared, the creatures in the ocean stopped. They froze, their glowing eyes fixed on the titan as if it was their master, their god. For a brief moment, everything went still. The soldiers were too stunned to move, their bodies frozen in place as they stared at the massive skeleton that loomed over them. The skeletal creature towered over them, its bones creaking as if it were waking from a deep slumber. And then, with a final, deafening roar, it began to move. Jimmy's heart hammered in his chest. "We're in over our heads," he muttered, his mind racing with the terrible implications of what they were facing. The skeleton, the creatures in the water, the ancient symbols. They were all part of something far larger, something that had been waiting for centuries. And now, it had been awakened. The soldiers turned to run, but they knew deep down that there was no escape from this. They had opened a door to the past, and now the past had come for them. The jungle had never felt so oppressive, the night so thick with fear. Jimmy's pulse thundered in his ears as he sprinted through the underbrush, his flashlight bouncing wildly, illuminating fleeting glimpses of trees, rocks, and shadows. Behind him, the earth trembled with the movement of the massive skeletal titan, its hollow eyes glowing in the distance like lanterns in the dark. The hum from the ocean had grown louder, almost deafening now, as though it was drawing closer to them, following them, hunting them. They were running on pure instinct, driven by terror more than anything else. They had no plan, no strategy, just a single, primal desire to escape. But deep down, Jimmy knew it wasn't going to be that easy. The very ground beneath them seemed to conspire against them, as if the island itself had turned against them. The tremors, the unnatural vibrations. It was like everything was alive, responding to the creatures in the sea, to the monstrous titan that had risen from the earth. "Keep moving!" Jimmy shouted over his shoulder, his voice rough with panic. "Don't stop! We can't outrun them, but we can't give up." Paul was at his side, breathing heavily, his eyes wide with fear. "Where are we going? What's out there? What's following us?" "I don't know," Jimmy admitted, his voice strained. "But we can't stop now. We need to find shelter, anything. We can't let them catch us out here." The group had split into smaller clusters, trying to cover more ground. But Jimmy had a terrible feeling. He could feel the eyes of the creatures on him, even though he couldn't see them. It was as if they were surrounding him. closing in on every side, pushing him deeper into the wilderness. The Titan's movements were too slow for it to catch up to them directly, but the creatures from the sea, the Megalodons, were fast, terrifyingly fast. And Jimmy knew that they were hunting. "Turner, where are the others?" Jimmy shouted, trying to keep his bearings as they veered left through the jungle. "They were right behind us," Turner called back. But Jimmy could hear the uncertainty in his voice. It wasn't just the terror of running through the jungle anymore. It was the realization that even if they escaped for the moment, they were still trapped. There was nowhere safe. Not on the cliffs. Not on the shore. The creatures were everywhere, and the Titan was their herald, a massive skeletal guardian that would never let them escape. Then, it happened. The ground beneath them shook again, more violently this time. The tremors were so strong they could barely stand, let alone run. The air crackled with an electric tension, like the world itself was about to split open. A distant roar, deep and guttural, rumbled from the ocean, a sound that seemed to vibrate in their bones. The sky above them had turned a sickly shade of green, like some invisible storm was gathering, and the wind had picked up, howling through the trees. "Get down!" Jimmy screamed, as the jungle canopy above them swayed ominously. He ducked behind a large rock, signaling for the others to follow. They huddled close, their bodies pressed to the ground, heartbeats in their throats, as the vibrations continued to shake the very air around them. For a moment, there was nothing. The noise stopped. The shaking stopped. It was almost too quiet, and then, through the stillness, they heard it. A high-pitched shriek, a sound so unnatural, so alien, that it sent every soldier's blood running cold. It was a scream from the depths of the ocean, a sound made by something so ancient and so terrifying that their minds couldn't even comprehend it. It pierced the night, echoing through the trees and rattling their bones. "What the hell is that?" Turner gasped, his voice barely audible. "I don't know," Jimmy said, his voice hoarse. "But I think it's coming for us." The sound continued, deafening and relentless, growing louder as it approached. It was like the earth itself was groaning in pain, reacting to whatever force had been unleashed from the depths. The soldiers were all on edge, eyes darting nervously as they tried to make sense of what was happening. But then, through the trees ahead, something moved. Slowly, deliberately. The shadows seemed to shift, to grow darker, and in the distance, they saw them. The creatures. The Megalodons. At first, they were just shadows on the horizon, barely visible through the trees. But as the shrieking noise grew louder, the shapes began to come into focus. Massive, terrifying forms, cutting through the underbrush, gliding effortlessly through the jungle as if they were made of shadow themselves. They moved with precision, like a well-oiled machine, each step in perfect synchronization, as though they had one single purpose: to find them. "We need to move!" Jimmy shouted. "Now!" The soldiers scrambled to their feet, their fear propelling them forward, but the creatures were too fast. They moved toward the soldiers with unnatural speed, their massive jaws snapping through the air. The ground beneath them trembled as one of the Megalodons lunged toward them, its enormous body crashing through the trees with terrifying force. The soldiers scattered, running in every direction, desperate to escape. But Jimmy knew there was no escape now. The creatures were everywhere. They were too fast, too strong. And the skeletal Titan was still out there, watching them from the shadows. The Kosta jungle was no longer a place of refuge. It was a maze, a trap, and the walls were closing in. The soldiers were surrounded by creatures from the ocean, by a forgotten god risen from the earth. They were being hunted. And Jimmy realized, with a sickening jolt, that they might never make it out alive. "Stay together," he screamed, But it was too late. The creatures were closing in, the jungle around them alive with the sound of growling, shrieking, and the crashing of enormous bodies tearing through the foliage. They were trapped. And there was no way out. The jungle was alive with chaos. The roar of the megalodons, the thrashing of trees as they moved through the dense foliage, filled the air with a primal, deafening sound. The soldiers ran blindly, their hearts pounding in their chests. But every step they took seemed to draw them deeper into the nightmare. There was no safe place anymore. The jungle had turned against them, and the creatures from the deep, once thought to be nothing more than legends, were now their relentless pursuers. Jimmy's mind was a blur of panic and determination. He could hear the others shouting for help, but the shrieks of the megalodons drowned everything out. His lungs burned, his legs screamed with exhaustion, but there was no stopping now. They had uncovered something that had been buried for centuries, and now it was too late to turn back. In the distance, he saw Paul trip over a root, his body crashing to the ground. Without thinking, Jimmy rushed to help him, pulling him to his feet. But as they looked around, the jungle seemed to close in on them, the shadows growing darker, the creatures getting closer. "Jimmy, what the hell is happening?" Paul gasped, his face pale with fear. "We've stirred something we shouldn't have," Jimmy replied, his voice strained. "The megalodons, the titan, the creatures in the jungle, it's all connected. And I think we've just uncovered the last piece of the puzzle." Paul's eyes widened in confusion, but before he could ask more questions, another loud crash sounded from the trees. The jungle seemed to ripple with an unnatural force, as if the very earth was shifting beneath them. The truth was more terrifying than they had imagined. What they had uncovered, the journal, the symbols, the strange markings, the skeletal titan, it was all connected to an ancient force that had been sleeping beneath the island for millennia. A forgotten race, a forgotten civilization, had once worshipped these creatures as gods. And now it seemed that those ancient forces were waking up, rising from the depths of time, and they were coming for them. "We need to find shelter," Jimmy shouted, his mind racing. "The creatures, they're coming from the sea, from the land. We need to find a place to hide until we can figure out what we're really dealing with." But it was too late. The jungle itself seemed to be alive, shifting, twisting, as if it were actively trying to keep them in its grasp. The soldiers had no choice but to push forward into the heart of the island, where they hoped they could find answers. But with every step, the sense of dread only deepened. The feeling that they were being drawn toward something ancient and terrible, grew stronger. And then, in the midst of the chaos, Jimmy saw it. At first it was just a flicker, a movement in the shadows. But as he stepped forward, his eyes widened in disbelief. There, in the clearing ahead, was something that could change everything. It was an altar. A massive stone structure covered in strange markings stood at the center of the clearing. It was old, ancient, covered in moss and vines, but the carvings were unmistakable. The symbols they had seen on the journal, on the stone tablet, were etched into the stone, wrapping around the altar like a dark and foreboding message. Jimmy approached cautiously, his heart hammering in his chest. The altar was unlike anything he had ever seen. It was as if it was meant to channel the power of the sea, to bind the ancient creatures to this world. And in the center of the altar, lying in the dim light, was an object, an artifact. Jimmy reached out, his fingers brushing the cold surface of the object. It was an ancient relic, crafted from something that resembled bone, but much harder, almost like stone. It was carved with intricate symbols he recognized from the journal. This was it. This was the final piece, the key to understanding everything they had encountered. As Jimmy lifted the object, A surge of energy shot through him, sending a jolt of power coursing through his body. The air seemed to vibrate with the force of it, the earth itself responding to the relic's presence. He could hear the distant hum of the ocean, louder now, almost like a chant, an incantation. And then, as if in response, the ground beneath them trembled once again. The megalodons, the creatures, the titan, they weren't just monsters. They were bound to this island, to this place, by something older than the world itself, an ancient pact, a forgotten ritual. And now, by touching this relic, Jimmy had inadvertently set it in motion. "We've made a mistake," Jimmy whispered, his eyes wide with realization. "We've awoken something that was never meant to be disturbed." The ground shook violently, and the air was filled with a deafening roar. From the ocean, from the jungle, from the very earth beneath their feet, something was rising. The creatures, the titan, and the ancient forces, they were all converging on this one point. They were coming for the soldiers. "We need to leave," Paul said, his voice trembling, but Jimmy shook his head. "There's nowhere to run. We've crossed a line. We can't escape what's coming." The sky above them seemed to crack open, and a bright flash of light illuminated the clearing. The creatures were coming. The ancient beings were rising, and nothing could stop them. The soldiers had uncovered the secret of the island, but they were too late to stop what had been set in motion. Jimmy stood frozen, the relic still in his hands. The truth had finally revealed itself, but at a terrible cost. The ancient forces were awake, and there was no turning back. The night sky cracked open with a flash of unnatural light, illuminating the jungle in an eerie, unearthly glow. For a moment, everything stood still. The shrieking of the megalodons, the rumble of the titan's skeletal form shifting beneath the earth, all of it stopped. The jungle itself seemed to hold its breath, as though the world was on the edge of some terrible precipice, and whatever lay ahead could not be avoided. And then it came. The earth groaned as if waking from a centuries-long slumber, its surface trembling in anticipation. The ocean, once a dark and distant force, now surged toward the shore with monstrous waves, swallowing the coastline in moments. The sky seemed to split open, darker clouds swirling above, churning with a malevolent force. There was no wind, just a suffocating pressure that made every breath feel like a struggle. The soldiers, now huddled together near the altar, could only watch in horror as the horrors they had unearthed surged back to life. The megalodons, massive and terrifying, breached the water with bone-shaking roars, their enormous fins slicing through the waves as they circled toward the shore. The air was thick with the stench of salt water, decay, and something far worse, a deep, ancient fear. What is happening?" Turner whispered, his voice trembling as he clutched his rifle, eyes wide with terror. "We've unleashed something," Jimmy replied, his voice barely audible. "Something ancient. Something beyond us." The relic still felt cold in his hands, its power pulsing through him like a dark heartbeat. He could feel the weight of the island on his shoulders, the weight of history, of forgotten gods, of forces that should have remained buried in the depths. And now, he realized, they were coming back. All of them. The ground beneath their feet began to crack, massive fissures appearing, splitting the earth as if it were paper. From these cracks, enormous shapes began to emerge, towering figures, too massive to be real. The skeletal titan, now fully risen, loomed over the soldiers, its hollow eyes glowing with a malevolent energy. Its bones creaked and groaned, and its massive form seemed to shimmer with a ghostly light, as though it was a relic of some forgotten age that had slipped through time. "It's not just the sea creatures," Jimmy whispered. "It's them, too." A massive, twisted roar shook the air as the Titan's jaw slowly opened, a low, guttural sound emanating from deep within its ribcage. The Megalodon stopped circling and turned toward it, as if responding to some ancient command. The earth itself was alive with energy now, vibrating with an intensity that made the soldiers' teeth rattle in their skulls. They were no longer in control. Whatever ancient pact had bound the creatures, the gods of the ocean, and the skeletal titan to this land had been broken. The forces were free now, free to claim the island once more. The soldiers, now paralyzed with fear, watched helplessly as the giant figures moved toward the center of the clearing. The altar, still pulsing with power, seemed to act as a conduit, a point where the creatures, the titan, and the dark forces all converged. There, in the heart of the island, something terrible was awakening, something older than time. "Run!" Jimmy finally shouted, snapping out of his paralysis. "We have to get out of here, now!" But it was already too late. A wave of unnatural energy surged outward from the altar, crashing into the soldiers like a physical force. The ground shook with a deafening roar, and the trees around them were uprooted, flung aside as if they were nothing more than paper. Jimmy staggered, struggling to maintain his footing as the relic in his hand pulsed with power, sending out ripples of dark energy that made his head spin. And then, through the chaos, he heard something that stopped him cold. A voice. It was deep, primal, echoing through the air, a voice that seemed to come from the very depths of the ocean. The cycle has begun again. The gods of the sea awaken. It wasn't a voice of a creature, it was something far worse, a god, or perhaps a manifestation of one. Jimmy could feel its presence, suffocating, overwhelming, as if the weight of an entire forgotten history was bearing down on him. "What the hell is that?" Paul shouted, panic rising in his voice. "I don't know," Jimmy muttered, his eyes scanning the chaos around them. "But I think it's talking to us." The waves crashed against the shore, the Megalodons swimming with terrifying precision toward the land, their jaws snapping as they closed in on the soldiers. The Titan moved too, its skeletal form towering above them, sending tremors through the earth with every step it took. The ground cracked open even wider as more of these ancient beings emerged, shadows of monsters long thought dead, now awakened to reclaim the world they had once ruled. The soldiers turned to flee, but it was no use. The land was closing in around them. There was nowhere to go. The forces that had once slumbered beneath the ocean, beneath the earth, were now free, and they were hunting them. "We can't outrun them," Turner shouted, his voice breaking. "They're everywhere." Jimmy's mind raced. There had to be a way out, a way to stop it, but as the Titan's massive, glowing eyes fixed on him, he realized the truth. There was no escape. The ritual, the pact, the ancient beings, they had all been a part of something far bigger than any of them could have ever understood. And now, in the wake of their actions, they had torn open a door to a world that was not meant to return. As the ground beneath them split wide, as the ocean rose up with an angry roar, Jimmy understood. There was no escape from the ancient gods of the sea. And now, they were here to reclaim the world. The end of their journey was only the beginning of something much darker. The night had become a living nightmare. The sky overhead churned with dark, swirling clouds, crackling with strange, unnatural energy. The earth trembled beneath the soldiers' feet, as though the island itself was alive, writhing in agony at the forces that had been unleashed. The Megalodons, massive and deadly, were closing in from the ocean, their glowing eyes tracking every movement. But it wasn't just the creatures from the depths that hunted them now. No, the true terror was the Titan. Its skeletal form towered above the jungle, its massive bones creaking and groaning with every step. It moved slowly, methodically, but with an undeniable purpose. The air around it hummed with an energy so powerful that the soldiers could feel it in their very bones. It was not just a creature, it was something ancient, a force of nature that had been waiting for this moment, waiting to awaken and reclaim the earth. The soldiers had no illusions left. There was no escape from the horrors that surrounded them. The jungle, the ocean, and the very earth were against them. Every corner they turned only revealed more of the monstrosities that had been hidden beneath the surface for so long. "We have to do something!" Paul shouted, his voice ragged with fear. "We can't just keep running!" Jimmy, his mind racing, glanced at the altar, still glowing faintly with the power they had unintentionally released. It was clear now. The creatures, the Titan, the ancient forces, they weren't random. They were tied to the altar, to the island, to something far older than humanity itself. The relic in his hand pulsed with dark energy, as if answering some unspoken call. "We need to destroy the altar," Jimmy said, his voice filled with a terrifying clarity. "If we can break the connection, we can stop this." "But how?" Turner gasped. "We don't even know what we're dealing with!" Jimmy didn't have all the answers, but one thing was certain. They couldn't keep running. The island was collapsing around them. The creatures were closing in, and they had awoken something that would never let them escape. There was only one chance. Destroy the source of the power that had brought them here. The soldiers, now fully aware of the magnitude of the situation, ran toward the altar, the ground shaking beneath them with each step. The Titan's skeletal eyes locked onto them, its gaze following their every movement, as if it had already decided their fate. They reached the altar, and Jimmy could feel the oppressive energy surrounding it, nearly suffocating them with its weight. The symbols on the stone surface seemed to pulse, glowing faintly in the dim light. The relic in his hands hummed with an almost malevolent energy, as if it were alive, responding to the power around them. "This is it," Jimmy said, his voice shaking with determination. "We destroy the altar. We destroy everything it's connected to." But just as he moved toward the altar, a deafening roar erupted from the ocean. A massive Megalodon surged from the water, its massive jaws snapping open with terrifying force. The soldiers scrambled back, but the creature was too quick, its massive body cutting through the jungle with speed that defied its size. Without thinking, Jimmy raised the relic, pointing it toward the Megalodon. The moment the relic's tip touched the air, a surge of energy blasted from it, a shockwave that tore through the jungle. The Megalodon screeched in pain, its body convulsing as the energy coursed through it. But it didn't stop. The Titan, now fully aware of their position, let out a deafening roar that shook the very ground beneath their feet. The soldiers could feel the ancient power emanating from it, an unyielding force that had been dormant for eons, now awake and ravenous. "Keep moving," Jimmy shouted. "We can't stop it with brute force. We need to break the connection." The soldiers fought against their fear, scrambling toward the altar, dodging debris as the Megalodon and Titan both closed in on them. The creature from the ocean thrashed through the jungle, uprooting trees and crushing everything in its path. The Titan's skeletal form moved with terrifying precision, its glowing eyes fixed on Jimmy as it stepped closer, each movement shaking the ground with a force that threatened to collapse everything around them. Jimmy raised the relic high, its power surging through him as he stepped toward the altar. The air grew heavier, as if the entire island was holding its breath, waiting for the final moment. He could feel the relic pulsing with power, guiding him toward the source of the ancient force. With a single, desperate motion, he thrust the relic into the heart of the altar. The earth shuddered violently, and a blinding light erupted from the altar. The relic, now fully charged with energy, sent a shockwave through the entire island. The sky cracked open, and the jungle around them seemed to explode as the energy surged outward. For a moment, everything stopped. The megalodons froze mid-roar. The titan, its massive bones creaking in agony, halted in its tracks. The ground beneath them shook with one final, deafening rumble, and then, as quickly as it had all begun, everything fell silent. The light from the altar began to fade, and the oppressive energy that had surrounded them slowly ebbed away. The roar of the ocean calmed, the earth's tremors subsided, and the creatures, the megalodons, the titan, the horrors from the deep, began to recede. The jungle, once alive with chaos, fell into an eerie stillness. Jimmy, his body trembling with exhaustion and fear, lowered the relic. He could feel the weight of what they had done, the destruction, the awakening, the consequences of their actions. They had destroyed the altar, the source of the power that had bound the ancient forces to the island. And now, those forces were retreating, but they weren't gone. The soldiers, breathing heavily, surveyed the wreckage around them. The jungle was still burning, the ocean's waves crashing violently against the shore, but the creatures were no longer pursuing them. The megalodons had returned to the depths, the titan to its resting place in the earth. "We did it," Paul breathed, his voice hoarse. "We stopped them." Jimmy shook his head slowly. "We stopped them. For now." The relic in his hands had stopped glowing, but Jimmy could feel it still humming faintly with dark energy. The island was quiet, but the damage was done. They had awoken something ancient, something powerful, and though they had broken its hold on the island, it would not be forgotten. "Let's get out of here," Jimmy said, his voice heavy with the weight of their victory and the dread of what had come before. The soldiers turned away from the altar, each step taking them further from the epicenter of the terror they had unleashed. But even as they walked, the feeling lingered. The island's secrets were far from buried, and the forces they had awakened were not gone. They had merely postponed the inevitable. The jungle was eerily silent as the soldiers trudged through the wreckage of what had once been their battleground. The ground was scorched, trees uprooted, and the air heavy with the scent of burning foliage and salt water. In the distance, the waves still crashed against the shore, but the ominous roars of the megalodons and the terrifying creaks of the skeletal titan had ceased. For now, at least, the island seemed to be at peace. But that peace felt hollow, as if something fundamental had been shattered in the process. Jimmy, still clutching the relic that had both saved and doomed them, could feel the weight of their actions pressing on him. The island had been broken, and with it, the barrier that had kept the ancient forces at bay. The power that had once bound the creatures and the titan was gone. But not entirely. It wasn't finished. Jimmy knew that in the deepest corners of his soul. The soldiers, exhausted and shaken, found their way to a small clearing, where the remnants of their camp lay in ruin. They sat down, their faces drawn with fatigue, not speaking, not knowing what to say. They had survived. But what was the cost? Jimmy's mind kept returning to the journal, to the relic, to the symbols that had led them down this path. Everything was connected. Every sighting, every strange event, every horrifying encounter. It had all been leading to this. But now that they had stopped the creatures and the titan, they were left with the lingering question. Why? Paul, his face pale and grim, was the first to break the silence. "Do you think it's over, Jimmy? The monsters, the titan, they're gone, right?" Jimmy shook his head slowly, his thoughts clouded with doubt. "I don't know. We've broken the link. The altar's destroyed, the relic's no longer glowing, but there's still something." What do you mean? Turner asked, his voice hoarse. Jimmy looked down at the relic, now dull and lifeless in his hands. It felt like a part of the island, as if the energy within it had never truly left, even after the altar's destruction. The island was never just a place, it was a prison for something ancient, something tied to the earth and the sea. The creatures, the Titan, they were its guards, its protectors. Protectors? Turner echoed, shaking his head. But what was it protecting? Why bring all that back? Why wake it up now? Because the barrier broke, Jimmy murmured. And it's not just the creatures we need to fear, it's the power they were protecting. The soldiers sat in stunned silence, the realization beginning to sink in. They had thought they were fighting against the monsters, the creatures of the deep, the Titan. But in truth, they had been fighting against an ancient, forgotten force, a force that had been contained by the island for millennia. You're saying there's more to this island than we thought? Paul asked, his voice trembling. Jimmy nodded. Yes. The altar, the relic, the creatures, they were all tied to an ancient power that could control the ocean, the land, and time itself. The island was never just a place, it was a seal, a prison for something far worse than the beasts we saw. The air felt thicker now, as if the weight of the truth was pressing down on them all. They had broken the seal. They had released the creatures, the Titan, and most importantly, the ancient force they had been guarding. Paul rubbed his face with his hands, exhaustion settling in. What does that mean for us? Are we just waiting for it to come back? Jimmy didn't answer right away. He knew that, for now, the creatures had retreated to the depths. The Titan had gone back to its slumber, and the island had fallen silent. But that silence didn't mean the threat was over. Far from it. I don't think we can stop it, Jimmy said softly. Not for good. There was a heavy silence as his words settled in. The soldiers had fought for their survival, but in the end, they hadn't truly defeated the darkness that had awakened. They had only postponed it. The ancient forces, the ones tied to the ocean, the earth, and the skies, had been disturbed. And now that they were awake, the island had become a ticking time bomb. The creatures would rise again. The Titan would return. And whatever lay beneath it all, the ancient force, would follow. You mean, we've made it worse? Turner asked, fear in his voice. Jimmy nodded slowly. We've made it worse. But it was always going to happen. The barrier was always going to break. It was just a matter of time. The soldiers fell silent, the gravity of their situation overwhelming them. They had fought to survive, to stop what they had unleashed. But now, the true horror set in. This wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. Jimmy stood, staring at the horizon where the ocean met the sky. The waves were calm now, but he knew it wouldn't last. He could still feel the energy of the island pulsing beneath his feet, like the beat of a heart that had never truly stopped. We have to leave, Jimmy said quietly. We need to warn the world. But what about the island? Paul asked. It's still here. It's not just here, Jimmy replied, his eyes darkening with the weight of his thoughts. It's everywhere. The forces we've awakened don't belong to this time. They belong to a past we can't even begin to understand, and they won't stop, not until they take everything. The soldiers knew what had to be done. They had to leave the island, leave it behind before the ancient power fully reawakened. But even as they made plans to escape, even as they turned away from the island's shores, they couldn't shake the feeling that they had only glimpsed a fraction of the truth. They had been pawns in a game far older than humanity itself. A game that wasn't over. As they made their way to the rescue boat, Jimmy looked back one final time at the island, the jungle, the ocean, the skies, It was all silent, as if the island itself was waiting for the right moment to rise again. "Don't forget," Jimmy murmured, his voice almost a whisper. "We may have escaped, but what we unleashed will come back." And as the boat sailed away into the distance, the island stood in silence, its secrets still buried beneath the waves. For now. The boat drifted silently through the calm, moonlit waters, far from the island that had nearly claimed their lives. The soldiers sat in exhausted silence, their faces pale, their eyes haunted by what they had witnessed. The island, once a strange, dangerous place, was now just a distant silhouette on the horizon. They had escaped, but the weight of what they had unleashed still hung heavily in the air. For a moment, it seemed like they were free. But freedom felt fleeting, like a fragile illusion that could disappear at any second. The silence between them was thick, each man lost in his thoughts, grappling with the events that had unfolded in those final, terrifying moments. Jimmy sat at the bow, his gaze fixed on the dark water. The relic, now dull and lifeless, still sat in his hand, the power it once held seeming like a distant memory. The island, the creatures, the Titan, they were all fading, but the truth lingered in his mind. The ancient power they had disturbed, the forces that had once been bound beneath the island, were still very much a threat. And it wasn't just about the island anymore. It was about the world. It was about everything. "Do you think we'll ever really escape it?" Turner asked suddenly, breaking the silence. His voice was strained, weary from everything they had been through. Jimmy didn't respond right away. He could still feel the island's power, the remnants of the energy that had surged through him when he touched the relic. It wasn't gone. It was just lying in wait. And somewhere, deep beneath the waves, something ancient was still awake. The barrier might have been broken, but it had not been destroyed. It was only a matter of time before the ancient forces returned, seeking to reclaim what had once been theirs. "I don't know," Jimmy said, his voice low. "But what we did, it won't stay buried, not forever." Paul, sitting quietly beside him, looked out at the ocean. "You really think they'll come back?" "They never left," Jimmy replied softly. "We just delayed it." The boat continued its slow journey, the waves gently rocking it back and forth. But Jimmy's mind raced. The creatures, the Titan, they weren't just ancient remnants of the past. They were symbols of something larger, a power that had shaped the earth long before humanity came into existence. And they were still here, lurking in the depths, waiting for the right moment to rise again. As the island disappeared behind them, a faint whisper seemed to ride on the wind, echoing from the distant shores. It was a voice, low, rumbling, like the sound of the ocean itself. Jimmy strained to hear it, but it was gone in an instant, swallowed by the vast, dark expanse of the sea. A reminder. A warning. "You hear that?" Turner asked, looking at Jimmy with wide eyes. "I did," Jimmy whispered, his heart racing. "We're not done. The island, the creatures, it's all connected. But whatever we did, it won't be enough." Paul clenched his fists, staring out at the horizon. "So, what do we do now?" "We warn the world," Jimmy said, his voice heavy with resolve. "We tell them what happened. We make sure no one else falls into the trap we did." But even as he spoke, a cold, creeping realization settled in. It wasn't just about warning others. It was about confronting something far larger than they had ever understood. They had fought against the island's power, but it wasn't something they could destroy. It wasn't something that could be eradicated with a single act of defiance. It was a force that existed in the bones of the earth, in the heart of the ocean, in the very air they breathed. And it was only a matter of time before it would return. The boat continued on its course, its engine humming steadily as it cut through the water. But no matter how far they went, no matter how quickly they escaped, Jimmy knew the truth. They hadn't truly left the island behind. The power that had been unleashed, the ancient forces they had disturbed, would not rest. And they would rise again. Perhaps not today, perhaps not tomorrow, but soon. The world would have to face the consequences of what had been awakened on that fateful island. And no one would be prepared for what was to come. Jimmy looked back one final time, staring at the dark, empty ocean. The island was gone, its secrets buried beneath the waves once more. But deep beneath the surface, something stirred, and it would not forget. As the boat moved further away, the only sound was the quiet hum of the engine and the distant crash of waves against the shore. But the soldiers knew that no matter how far they sailed, the island's legacy would follow them. The creatures, the Titan, the ancient power, it was all still out there, and it was waiting. "Do you think it will ever end?" Turner asked, his voice barely a whisper. Jimmy turned to look at his companions, his face grim. "No," he said, his voice carrying a weight that none of them could escape. "It won't, not until it's ready. And when it is, none of us will be ready. The end, for now." And just like that, our journey through the mysteries of the Pacific has come to an end. But the haunting echoes of the creatures, the Titan, and the ancient forces we uncovered will linger in our minds long after the last page is turned. To each and every one of you who joined us, thank you from the bottom of our hearts. You've been with us through the dark, through the unknown, and now you've seen the truth. The island's secrets are far from forgotten. And who knows, maybe the creatures, the power, and the terrifying legacy we've uncovered will rise again, just waiting for the right moment to return. But for now, it's your turn. What do you think? Did the relic truly destroy the ancient forces, or is this just the beginning of something even darker? What's next for the survivors, and what's next for the world, knowing that these powers are still out there, dormant, waiting? Join the conversation in the comments below. Share your theories, your thoughts, and what you think the future holds. If you enjoyed this journey, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so you never miss another mystery that needs uncovering. And remember, some stories never end. They just wait for the right moment to be told again. Until next time. Stay curious, stay brave, and most importantly, stay prepared. New Moon.